want to follow up on a different but related note to that. You've always been somebody who I think has been very effective against the idea of moral means testing. You know, the idea that different people have to kind of cross it's kind of like the moral corollary of just actual means testing, that, well, if you just talk too much about universal decency and justice for all, that might include some bad people. Now, of course, one part of it is, I think, a broader, very important left idea of, well, I think as much as humanly possible, we don't want to write anybody off as not being, redeemable or changeable or anything like that. And also, secondly, who cares? In the sense that when we're talking about really basic targets like healthcare, so what? Why does somebody have to perform in any type of exceptional way, one way or another, to secure basic decency in life? And I think we've been talking, I think, for like 3 years, and that's a very clear through line for you. And there was a stake of that in this election. And I'd like you to bring that into the mix as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because I come to this whole world, this whole professional and kind of political world, not because I, was a red diaper baby, and not because I came up through politics. I was genuinely guided by just my own sense of kind of secular humanist ethical development, which says to me, well, I'm a liberal, I live on the left, or however you want to describe it, because I believe in the intrinsic value of human life. And that's what guides my understanding that, mass incarceration is vile. That's what guides my understanding that we shouldn't throw away people through our criminal justice system, that rehabilitation should be the goal of any kind of criminal justice, and that, we shouldn't discriminate against people once they are out of prison. It guides my understanding that you are not worth the worst thing that you ever did in your life. It guides my understanding that everyone deserves health care, no matter your economic status, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And when we talk in those kinds of terms on safe ground like criminal justice, where there's, I think, less of a gap between kind of mainstream liberals and the left, although there is a gap, everyone seems to get these principles. But when you start to get into other areas, when you start to talk about racism, for instance, other kinds of personal prejudice, it becomes very black or white. So you live in this really unsettled world where, Democrats will understand that we should have rehabilitation, and that a prison sentence is a sentence where that allows you to get raped or be in solitary confinement, and that should be how the world is. But at the same time, we'll say the person who wants, use an epithet is canceled forever. And you have liberals saying the things that we used to, criticize conservatives for saying about, a conservative would say, Hurricane Katrina, they brought it on themselves because of all the sin in Louisiana or whatever. They'll say things like that. Now we have Democrats saying things about how, these voters in southern states, or they deserve coronavirus, and the Republican legislatures that, are not following CDC recommendations or having shutdowns, right? Or, Trump voters deserve to live in squalor. They voted for him, and that's kind of the world that they deserve, the outcome that they deserve. Not thinking about worlds of imperfect information and the extent to which their lives have intrinsic value, and people change and evolve over time, and they have children who did not make those kind of voting choices, who live in those households, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it's that kind of inconsistency is what I really think gives a foothold to so many of these alt-right interlocutors who have been able to recruit so heavily in the last few years, because they have been able to seize on legitimate inconsistencies and legitimate criticisms within kind of the democratic or broadly left logic framing. And so much of the writing that I did before I joined the Sanders campaign was about trying to clarify where we actually stand on a number of issues, from more minor things like cultural appropriation discourse to more substantive things like how identity is weaponized in politics, precisely because I want to shore up our position, not because I want to attack the left, but because I believe the underlying principles are real and true, and that we should have the best arguments that aren't so easily weaponized against us.
I agree completely.
Yeah.
And can I just say really, really quick? I think attacking the left is the notion that you are going to say, I'm on the left, but I actually don't want to achieve the substantive principles of the left. Understanding where there are weaknesses and where the game needs to be upped, that's like saying the coach of a basketball team running drills is opposing his team. Like, it's ludicrous. Of course you need to up your game.
As a former varsity basketball player, I really love that analogy.
Nice.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And, just to give a recent example, we had a discussion about the optics of, doing this video in front of your $24,000 refrigerators and showing off your collection of luxury ice cream in the middle of a pandemic where people are literally starving and do not know how they're going to pay for their rent, for their mortgage. It's a discussion about optics, about political strategy, and what Pelosi did in that video was incredibly dumb. I'm just going to call it exactly what it is. It's dumb. And when we did a segment on it, I said that it's going to be used against her by the Trump campaign. And guess what? It was used against her by the Trump campaign. Because while Donald Trump and Republicans are absolute liars when they pretend as though they care about the working class and improving the economy for the majority of Americans, they're successful in their messaging, their empty, hollow messaging, and they do, in a very, very successful way, paint Democrats like Nancy Pelosi as these corporatists who have helped to ship jobs abroad, who live in, luxury, who enjoy their wealth, and who really screwed up the manufacturing sector in America. They're really good at that kind of messaging. And when we talk about those types of stories, it's incredible the type of reaction we'll get from the Democratic Party, from moderate Democrats. Like, we're the bad guys for pointing out a very obvious flaw that is going to be used against Democrats. And it was used against Democrats. And so, how did we get here where we shoot the messenger? We shoot the people who actually can see things clearly rather than addressing the very real issues within the party, right? The weaknesses that lead to someone like Donald Trump getting elected.
Yeah, I think about that a lot. I mean, there's an argument that Democrats don't want to win, that they are equally satisfied by either corporate party being in charge, their interests are served either way. And so if the question is between the only life kind of on the left coming from a progressive movement that is going to be a direct threat to those interests, then they're happy to basically throw the game. Sometimes I'm feeling very cynical and that's where I am. Other times I say, even if I think that that's happening, that has a kind of defeatist air about it and we can't embrace that. So what else is happening? Well, sometimes I think psychologically that Democrats are in a kind of a losing defensive posture. Donald Trump does present a existential, terrifying threat, especially looking down the barrel of another 4 years. And maybe it's just don't kick a man while he's down, kind of an attitude where the party feels too vulnerable, or members of the party, voters feel too vulnerable to be really clear-eyed about what the flaws in our own messaging are. I also think to the extent that Bernie Sanders was often characterized as a cult leader and his followers as somehow biased worshipers that weren't willing to be critical of him. I think that the truth is that the Democratic Party has propped up figures, Nancy Pelosi being one of them, that are perceived more so for their kind of just symbolic value as opposed to any understanding of what role they've played in the party, and including detrimental roles that they've played in the party over time. So if Nancy Pelosi to you is this totem who, shades Trump in a viral GIF, clapping at the State of the Union, then yeah, you're going to be less willing to perceive her as someone who is flawed in any way. And ultimately, the point isn't that Nancy Pelosi is more affluent than the average voter, or even that she has, $9 pints of ice cream or however much Talenti costs. Who amongst us hasn't enjoyed a Talenti pint in their life? The ice cream is delicious. the point is making the choice in terms of optics, frame herself that way, and to be so tone deaf about the criticism that you would double down and refuse to acknowledge the underlying structural issues that are revealed by that kind of a moment, right? So why is it that Nancy Pelosi has been able to accumulate such an enormous amount of wealth while a sitting member of Congress for decades? Why is it that there are so many people who are completely thrown from food insecurity to full-on, full-blown access to food in the context of a crisis like this? What, you know, and so when she shows up in front of a refrigerator at a press conference with a admittedly very chic color-coded scarf around her mouth, it's frustrating. It's not, and I don't want to mix up the criticism of, you know, Nancy Pelosi is a bad person because she has money, because I think a lot of Americans are, you know, I don't agree with their politics, but are aspirational. They don't like the idea of criticizing someone just because they're affluent. I think the criticism from the left has to always be about why is the distribution of wealth the way it is? What structural factors enable her to accumulate so much wealth that she has not one, but a zillion pints of ice cream in this multi, you know, whatever, how much her refrigerator costs, $12,000, $24,000, whatever it is. Though that is where the argument is the strongest. That's, I think, where Bernie Sanders got a lot of his power, especially in 2016, talking about the 99% and the 1% and the oligarchy and corporate greed and all of those kinds of themes. And so there's lessons there for both the left in terms of how we frame our critique, and also for this center left, whatever, mainstream Democrats, about how to be more clear-eyed. And if they want to actually win, if they want to stop kind of reveling in the idea that they're right or they're smarter and like dunking on Trump because he tells people to drink bleach, like, yes, like we know he's terrible, he's not intelligent. Like these are not, this shouldn't be fodder for ongoing comedy at this point. It's tragic, but what do you do? What part of what Trump is doing is resonating and accessible to a substantial percentage of the population? And can we focus on that to the same way that we need to focus on what it is that's motivating hostility against Nancy Pelosi outside of just the idea of focusing ire against somebody who's absent?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, you're absolutely right.